You're standing in a field, centuries before anyone alive today was born, and something just fell out of the sky. Not rain, not lightning. A rock, glowing faintly, still warm to the touch, buried in a shallow crater it punched into the ground moments ago, dirt and scorched grass scattered around it in a rough circle. You dig it out with your bare hands once it cools enough to touch, and it feels wrong immediately, heavier than any stone has any right to be, dense in a way nothing from the ground around you ever is, cold and smooth on the outside, despite the heat it just carried down from the sky. You don't know it yet, and there's no way you possibly could, but you're holding a piece of solid metal that formed inside the core of a dead star system, hammered together by unimaginable pressure over billions of years, older by a wide margin than the planet you're currently standing on. To you, right now, in this moment, it's simply the strangest object you've ever touched in your life, and it very clearly didn't come from anywhere around here. For well over 1,000 years after moments like this one, across multiple ancient civilizations scattered thousands of miles apart, civilizations that never spoke to each other, never traded with each other, never even knew the others existed, this exact material, iron, got treated as something close to sacred everywhere it turned up, rarer than gold, reserved for kings, for gods, for the tips of ceremonial blades meant to be buried with pharaohs rather than used in a single ordinary fight. And yet, within a relatively short stretch of history afterward, that same material became the cheapest, most disposable substance humans have ever mass-produced, sitting in every nail, every fence post, every piece of scrap metal rusting quietly in a junkyard. So how does something once worshipped as a literal gift, fallen from the heavens, restricted to kings and reserved for royal tombs, end up becoming the least precious material on the entire planet, sold by the ton, thrown away without a second thought? How do you go from this belongs to a king, and only a king, to this belongs in a landfill in the span of human history? It's not one single invention, and it's not one lucky accident either, no matter how tempting that simpler version of the story might be. It's a story that involves a civilization-wide collapse nobody fully saw coming, a desperate scramble for substitute material under real pressure, and centuries of ordinary people repeatedly hammering a hot, spongy mess of metal because melting it properly was, for a very long time, simply, physically impossible with the tools available to them. Let's get into it. Here's the number that sets up just how strange this story really is, right from the start. Iron and steel, which is really just iron mixed carefully and deliberately with a small, controlled amount of carbon, account for something like 90% of all metal produced on Earth today, by weight, easily outproducing every other metal combined many times over, by a margin that isn't even particularly close. It's in the frame of the building you're sitting in right now, the car in your driveway, the fork in your kitchen drawer, the bridge you drove over this week, without giving it a second thought. It is, without much serious competition, the single most industrially important material humanity has ever gotten its hands on, the quiet backbone of essentially the entire built world around you. None of that was remotely obvious. For most of the time, humans actually had access to it. For well over 1,000 years, iron wasn't a workhorse material buried in every wall and every tool. It was closer to myth you could, on rare occasion, actually hold in your hand. Start with an object that ended up buried alongside one of the most famous rulers in all of human history. When King Tutankhamun's tomb was opened in the 1920s, sealed and undisturbed for over 3,000 years, among the gold and the jewels and the elaborate funerary equipment, archaeologists found a dagger with an iron blade, finely crafted, clearly ceremonial, resting in a sheath decorated with gold granulation. For decades afterward, researchers debated exactly where that iron had actually come from, since Egypt in that era, roughly 1,300 years before the Common Era, had essentially no iron smelting industry of its own to speak of, no established local supply chain that could explain a finely worked iron blade showing up in a royal tomb. In 2016, a team led by materials scientist Daniela Camelli at the Politecnico di Milano in Italy finally got the chance to test the blade directly, using portable X-ray fluorescence analysis, a non-invasive technique that reads the chemical composition of an object's surface without cutting into it or damaging it in any way, a crucial requirement for testing an irreplaceable royal artifact. The result confirmed what some researchers had long suspected but never been able to prove. The dagger's iron contained an unusually high concentration of nickel, in a specific ratio that essentially never occurs naturally in iron or dug up from the ground anywhere on Earth, but shows up reliably, consistently, in iron that fell from space and survived its trip through the atmosphere. Tutankhamun's dagger wasn't forged from mined iron ore at all. It was hammered, painstakingly, from a meteorite, quite literally a fallen star, shaped by ancient craftsmen into a blade fit to accompany a king into the afterlife. And Egypt wasn't alone in treating fallen sky metal this way, not even close. Ancient texts from the Hittite Empire, centered in what's now Turkey, and from Mesopotamia further east, both describe iron using language that translates roughly to metal from heaven or sky metal, language deliberately reserved for something considered genuinely otherworldly, not just another material sitting alongside copper and bronze on a merchant's table in the local market. In several surviving Hittite and Mesopotamian records, iron gets listed as more valuable than gold, item for item, weight for weight, a genuinely startling reversal compared to how those same two metals would eventually be valued only a few centuries later, once the balance of scarcity finally flipped. One particularly striking piece of evidence comes from the royal archives at Hattusa, the Hittite capital, where surviving cuneiform correspondence includes a letter from a Hittite king politely explaining to a foreign ruler requesting iron that good iron simply wasn't currently available to send, that the Royal Iron Workshop was, for the moment, unable to produce any, and that whatever could eventually be spared would follow later. Read plainly, it's a diplomatic letter about a supply shortage. Read in context, it's direct written proof that even the single most powerful iron-producing kingdom in the region at the time genuinely struggled to keep up with demand for the material, treating it as a controlled, restricted resource worth apologizing over rather than something readily available to hand out on request. Which raises an obvious question. If people already had access to iron, in however limited a quantity, and clearly prized it enormously enough to write diplomatic letters about its scarcity, why did it take so unbelievably long, centuries longer, for anyone to start using it the way we use it today, as an ordinary, everyday, thoroughly unglamorous material sitting in a kitchen drawer? Which raises an obvious question, one worth sitting with for a moment before moving on. The answer sits in two separate, compounding problems, and understanding both of them together is really the key that unlocks this entire story. The first problem, the most basic and obvious one of the two, is availability, and it's simpler to explain than the second. Meteoritic iron, the kind that fell from the sky and landed conveniently on the ground ready to be picked up, is astonishingly rare. You can't plan an entire economy, an army, or civilization around passively waiting for the next chunk of usable metal to fall out of the sky at complete random and land, somewhere, a human being happens to actually find it in time. For iron to become a genuinely widespread, ordinary material available to more than just royalty, someone needed to figure out how to pull it directly out of ordinary iron ore, dug straight from the ground beneath their feet, which is vastly more abundant than any meteorite could ever be, but comes locked inside solid rock in a stubborn chemical form that isn't remotely usable on its own without serious processing. The second problem, and this is the one that actually held things up for centuries even after people started genuinely trying to solve it, is temperature, and it turned out to be a brutal engineering obstacle that took an enormous amount of accumulated trial and error to work around. Bronze, the dominant metal of the era before iron eventually took over, melts at a relatively manageable temperature, one that ancient furnaces of the time could reach without too much specialized difficulty, which meant bronze could simply be melted down into a fully liquid state and poured into a mold, cooled, and popped out ready to use, a comparatively forgiving, predictable process that skilled bronze workers had refined over many centuries. Iron behaves in a completely different, far less cooperative way. Its actual melting point sits dramatically higher than anything ancient furnace technology could reliably produce for a very long stretch of history, high enough that achieving it consistently wouldn't become practical until industrial-era blast furnace technology arrived, thousands of years later. Early iron workers, as a direct result, weren't melting iron at all, not in any sense you'd recognize from a modern foundry pouring liquid steel. They were instead relying on something called a bloomery, a relatively simple clay or stone furnace that could get hot enough, using charcoal as both fuel and a chemical reducing agent, combined with a forced air supply pumped in through bellows to chemically strip the iron away from the oxygen and rock it was naturally bound up with inside the ore, all without ever fully liquefying the metal itself at any point in the process. What came out of a bloomery after hours of continuous, exhausting labor wasn't a clean ingot ready for immediate use, the way a bronze casting would be. It was something archaeologists call a bloom, a lumpy, spongy, deeply unglamorous mass of solid iron still thoroughly tangled up with slag, the leftover glassy waste material left behind from the smelting reaction, not unlike a scorched, misshapen sponge that happened to have actual usable metal trapped somewhere inside it. To turn that unpromising mess into an actual usable blade, tool, or weapon, someone then had to reheat it in the coals and hammer it, over and over, forcing the still molten slag physically out through repeated blows, while the iron itself stayed stubbornly solid the entire time, behaving far more like working stiff, resistant clay than pouring any kind of liquid metal into a waiting mold. Archaeologist Radomir Planer, who spent decades studying the technical development of early iron production across Europe and the Near East, documented just how labor-intensive and skill-dependent this early bloomery process actually was, requiring not one clever insight, but an accumulated body of trial-and-error craft knowledge, refined slowly across many generations of smiths who mostly never fully understood the underlying chemistry of what they were doing. Bronze casting, by comparison, was almost forgiving. Iron smelting, for centuries, was punishing, unreliable, and produced a rougher, often genuinely inferior final product compared to a well-made bronze weapon crafted by an experienced bronze smith. So if early iron was harder to produce, and often not even better than bronze once you had it, what actually forced the switch? The answer is a crisis, not a breakthrough, and understanding that distinction changes the entire shape of this story. Around 1200 BCE, across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, a remarkable cluster of powerful, deeply interconnected Bronze Age civilizations, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, various Egyptian dynasties, all bound together by centuries of long-distance trade and diplomatic contact, collapsed within roughly the same narrow window of just a few decades, a period of upheaval so sudden and so widespread that it remains one of the most debated turning points in ancient history. Historian Eric Klein, at George Washington University, in his widely read analysis of this period, argues the collapse wasn't caused by any single dramatic event that historians can point to and blame outright, but by a perfect storm of compounding pressures hitting all at once, including invasions by groups often referred to collectively as the Sea Peoples, a string of severe, sustained droughts, devastating earthquakes striking multiple major cities in close succession, and internal political unrest, with each individual problem making every other problem measurably worse, feeding into a spiral no single kingdom could manage on its own. Buried inside that broader civilizational collapse was a much narrower, more technical crisis that mattered enormously for the specific story of iron. Bronze isn't simply copper. It's an alloy, meaning copper deliberately combined in careful proportion with a second metal, almost always tin, and tin deposits in the ancient world were geographically scarce, concentrated in only a handful of known locations, often located extremely far away from where the finished bronze was actually being manufactured and put to use. The shipwreck discovered off the coast of Uluburun, in modern Turkey, dated to roughly this same turbulent era, was found on the seafloor loaded with raw copper and tin ingots, direct, tangible physical evidence of just how far and just how fragile the trade networks supplying Bronze Age civilization with its single most critical raw material genuinely were, stretched across the entire eastern Mediterranean and beyond. When those trade networks collapsed alongside the broader political and military chaos of the era, reliable access to tin collapsed right along with them. Bronze production didn't necessarily stop overnight everywhere all at once, but it became significantly harder, less predictable, and considerably more expensive across huge stretches of the region within a remarkably short span of time. Iron ore, meanwhile, was comparatively common and widely distributed, often available locally, in many of the very same regions now struggling desperately to secure enough tin to keep producing bronze at the scale their armies, their temples, and their economies had come to depend on for generations. So picture the actual moment this shift really took hold, on the ground, in a workshop, not in some abstract historical summary. At a site called Tel Hammeh, in modern Jordan, archaeologists led by researcher Zander Veldhuizen uncovered what's considered one of the earliest dedicated ironworking installations found anywhere in the region, dated to roughly 930 BCE, well into the thick of this broader transitional period between one dominant metal and the next. It wasn't a temple. It wasn't a palace workshop quietly producing ceremonial daggers reserved for royalty and buried with the dead. It was, by every indication in the archaeological layout uncovered at the site, a working production facility, furnace remains clustered together, layers of slag deposits built up over repeated use, the unmistakable physical debris of people repeatedly, systematically, practically trying to turn ordinary rock into usable metal tools at something resembling real scale, not for kings and priests, but for ordinary, everyday use among the general population. Imagine the smith actually working at a site like that, hands blackened, sweating near a furnace that never seemed to cool down. His father, or whoever had trained him, likely worked almost entirely in bronze, casting weapons and tools using techniques passed down with real confidence and predictability, techniques that mostly worked the way they were supposed to work, generation after generation, with few surprises. The smith is doing something considerably harder and far less forgiving than anything his teacher ever had to manage. He's packing charcoal and crushed iron ore into a clay furnace built into the ground, pumping air into it continuously with a bellows for hours on end, watching for a very particular color and consistency in the glowing mass inside, a subtle visual cue that only years of failed attempts and hard-won experience could ever teach him to reliably recognize. When he finally pulls the bloom out of the furnace, it doesn't look anything like success. It looks, to any untrained eye, like a ruined, half-melted mistake, ugly, uneven, riddled with visible impurities and streaked with slag. Then the actual work really begins, the part that takes hours rather than minutes. He reheats it in the coals and hammers it. Reheats it again, and hammers again, folding the metal back on itself repeatedly, driving out the trapped slag bit by bit with every single strike of the hammer. A grueling, repetitive process that might consume hours of hard physical labor to produce just one usable blade, compared to the relatively quick pour and cool process bronze casting had always demanded of his predecessors. A difference in effort his aching arms would have understood better than any historian writing about it centuries later. Here's the twist that reframes this entire story, the part that flips the standard, ancient humans discovered a superior new metal narrative directly on its head. For a significant stretch of the actual transition, early iron tools and weapons weren't clearly better than well-made bronze ones, and in plenty of individual cases, they were noticeably worse. In some documented cases, early ironwork was genuinely inferior, softer, more prone to bending under stress or breaking outright under repeated impact, produced by smiths still working out an unfamiliar, deeply unforgiving process through hard-won trial and error rather than any kind of confident, established mastery passed down cleanly from teacher to student. Archaeologist Jane Waldbaum, whose research focused specifically on the earliest phases of Iron Age technology across the Eastern Mediterranean, noted that the initial shift toward iron looks far less like people enthusiastically abandoning bronze because iron was obviously, immediately superior, and far more like people being pushed, reluctantly and out of genuine necessity, toward iron because bronze had simply become unreliable to obtain at all, regardless of how good or how mediocre. The iron they got back in return actually turned out to be, for those first difficult generations of ironworking, iron only became genuinely, unambiguously superior to bronze once smiths, across many generations of continued trial and error, stretching long after that initial rocky transition, eventually worked out how to deliberately control carbon content during repeated forging and reheating, gradually inventing something closer to early steel, a harder, more durable, more genuinely useful material than either plain iron or well-made bronze had ever managed to be on their own. That refinement took centuries to fully mature, spreading unevenly across different regions at different speeds. The initial switch to iron wasn't chasing a superior product that everyone could immediately see and desire. It was chasing any available product at all, in a world where the old, comfortable, well-understood one had abruptly, and for reasons largely outside anyone's control, become impossible to reliably get. Now look at what that leaves sitting in your kitchen drawer, or holding up the very ceiling above your head right now, at this exact moment. Every piece of steel in your life, every skyscraper's structural frame, every car body, Every kitchen knife you've ever used without a second thought traces its lineage back through thousands of years of continuous, incremental refinement to a handful of increasingly frustrated Bronze Age smiths who didn't set out to invent a superior technology at all, who almost certainly would have preferred to keep doing things the old, familiar way if the world around them had simply allowed it. They were reacting to supply chain collapse, adapting under genuine, immediate pressure with whatever local material happened to still be reliably available to them, using a process that was, by any honest measure available to historians today, considerably more difficult and less forgiving than the one it was slowly, reluctantly, generationally replacing. A pattern, a comfortable, well-established system breaking down under unexpected pressure and forcing a scramble toward a rougher but more resilient and more locally available alternative, shows up again and again across human history and arguably still shows up today, whenever a single fragile long-distance supply chain for one genuinely critical material gets disrupted and entire industries are forced to scramble toward a less convenient but more dependable substitute. The Bronze Age didn't end because bronze itself stopped working or because anyone stopped wanting it. It ended because the fragile thousand-mile trade network required to keep making bronze at any meaningful scale broke down almost all at once, and iron, unglamorous, difficult, painstakingly slow to work, but locally abundant nearly everywhere people actually lived, was simply what was still standing afterward, waiting to be picked up by whoever was desperate enough to make it work. You're standing in a field, centuries before anyone alive today was born, and something just fell out of the sky, dense, strange, clearly not from here, clearly precious enough that a king would eventually want it buried alongside him for the afterlife. It would take well over 1,000 years, an empire-wide collapse nobody saw coming, a broken trade network stretching across the entire Mediterranean, and generations of increasingly skilled smiths hammering ugly, spongy metal in the dark beside a furnace that never quite cooled down, before that same fallen star, in every practical, unglamorous, everyday sense, ended up as the ordinary nail holding your front door shut.